Only a few months after her marriage to Henry Jacobs, 20-year-old Zina D. Huntington was approached by her older brother Dimmick with a message from Joseph Smith. "Tell Zina, I put it off and put it off, till an angel with a drawn sword stood by me, and told me if I did not establish that principle upon the earth, I would lose my position and my life." With the life of her prophet in her hands, Zina must have felt tremendous pressure. But Smith promised that she would receive a spiritual manifestation that the principle of plural marriage was true, similar to what she had experienced at her conversion. After several months of spiritual turmoil and contemplation, Zina received her witness and finally agreed to help her prophet keep God's commandment. Zina was pregnant and married to Henry Jacobs for 6 months when Dimmick married her to 35-year-old Joseph Smith on the 27th of October, 1841. Zina was his second plural and first polyandrous marriage in Nauvoo. Of the more than 30 women who married Joseph Smith, at least 14 were polyandrous marriages similar to Zina's. Joseph Smith may have believed that plural marriage was part of the restoration of all things, but convincing some of his followers, let alone his wife Emma, to participate proved especially difficult. Yet he proceeded to cajole women into marrying him as only a charismatic leader could. The story of the angel with the drawn sword was repeated many times, but he also promised families eternal life for their sacrifice and obedience. What choice did they have but to follow God's prophet? As many people find this aspect of Joseph Smith's career troubling, Mormon apologists have attempted to minimize and explain away the evidence, claiming that most of the polyandrous marriages were for the next life only, and 3 others had special circumstances. In the previous video, I used the case of Sylvia Lyon to show that Joseph Smith's marriages to other men's wives included sexual relations, and the special circumstances of this case proved especially compelling. When DNA research showed that Josephine was the daughter of Windsor Lyon instead of Joseph Smith, as Sylvia mistakenly believed, it implied that she was having sex with both men around the same time. This is probably the best evidence for sexual polyandry, although we have other compelling evidence to consider as well. Understandably, these Victorian women were hesitant to discuss their sexual lives, especially something as controversial as polyandry. So some of the evidence is not explicitly stated, but is strongly implied or unintentionally revealed. In this video, I will discuss the evidence for sexual polyandry among Joseph Smith's other wives, and examine some of the apologists' arguments to escape this evidence. As in the previous video, I will deal primarily with the writings of Brian C. Hales, the leading proponent of the non-sexual, no polyandry interpretation. Hales has become the chief source for other apologetic treatments of Joseph Smith's polyandry, including at the LDS Church's website at lds.org. Before we look at the specific circumstances of the marriages of these 14 women to Joseph Smith, it is necessary to discuss a few of Hales' assumptions that form the theoretical framework upon which he bases his belief that Joseph Smith did not practice sexual polyandry. The key assumption and rationale by which Hales interprets the data can be summed up in the following syllogism. Joseph Smith was a true prophet. A true prophet wouldn't practice sexual polyandry. Therefore, Joseph Smith didn't practice sexual polyandry. Based on this assumption, Hales evidently believes he is justified in explaining Smith's actions in accordance with that assumption, no matter how improbable it may appear. The problem is, Hales doesn't know what a true prophet would and would not do, especially one who believed that whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, even if it is considered abominable by a majority of Christians. Still, Hales reasons that Joseph Smith's revelation on plural marriage defined polyandry as adultery, and therefore Joseph Smith would not have violated his own principle. Historians call this kind of reasoning the idealist fallacy, because they know that people do not always live up to their ideals, and it is a mistake to interpret history through the lens of an ideal. Besides, the revelation Hales references was dictated in July 1843, after he had married most, if not all, of his polyandrous wives, and the document can be read as his repentance from polyandry rather than a prohibition. Let's be clear, not all apologists believe they need to deny Joseph Smith's polyandry included sexuality. Believing historian D. Michael Quinn, for example, freely admits Joseph Smith practiced sexual polyandry, but continues to believe Joseph Smith was a true but flawed prophet. Hales and other conservative apologists, on the other hand, are reluctant to give up the myth of the saintly prophet and can't bear the thought that he practiced sexual polyandry or committed adultery, even though we have a revelation where it appears he later repented and God forgave him. Let no one, therefore, set on my servant Joseph, for I will justify him, for he shall do the sacrifice which I require at his hands for his transgressions, saith the Lord your God. This theme of repentance and salvation runs through the revelation Joseph Smith dictated for Emma. The verse that immediately follows this defines plural marriage in a way that excludes polyandry. If any man espouse a virgin, and desire to espouse another, and the first give her consent, and if he espouse the second, and they are virgins, and have vowed to no other man, then he is justified. He cannot commit adultery, for they are given unto him. For they cannot commit adultery with that belongeth unto him and to no one else. And if he have 10 virgins given unto him by this law, he cannot commit adultery. The juxtaposition of repentance and polyandry is our first clue that it was indeed sexual and not merely for the next life. Let there be no mistake. Hales is a committed apologist who is more concerned about defending Joseph Smith from the embarrassment of polyandry than with formulating probable reconstructions of the past. He therefore wants to make it as difficult as possible to conclude Joseph Smith practiced sexual polyandry. We saw this clearly on display in the previous video, where in the case of Sylvia and Windsor Lyon, the evidence was quite clear that she was having sex with both Windsor and Joseph Smith. Of course, if this evidence doesn't cause Hales to reassess his theory, it's not likely that other cases, not involving DNA and signed affidavits, is going to convince someone as committed as Hales appears to be, though they are compelling in other ways. The first thing to notice about Hales' methodology is that he sets up the rules of evidence in a way in which he cannot lose and is sure to win. For example, he demands that advocates of sexual polyandry produce explicit evidence of sexuality on the part of both Joseph Smith and the legal husband, and he uses the unique case of Sarah Ann Whitney to justify that demand. On the 27th of July, 1842, Joseph Smith married 18-year-old Sarah Ann Whitney in Nauvoo, Illinois, and then on the 29th of April, 1843, she married and lived with Joseph C. Kingsbury as a pretend or front husband. From this, Hales argues, Kingsbury's relationship with Sarah Ann shows that Joseph Smith's plural wives could enter a legal marriage with another man to shield the prophet from suspicion by the public and by law enforcement officers. Importantly, it also demonstrates that a woman living under the same roof as a man to whom she was legally married does not automatically verify a sexual connection between her and her legal husband. In other words, documenting sexual polyandry generally requires specific evidence of conjugality between the woman and both husbands during the same time period. Importantly, such evidence has not been identified in any of the 14 alleged polyandrous marriages. The problem with this thinking is that Sarah Ann's situation was nothing like the other polyandrous marriages. In fact, it was the opposite from the others, and therefore can't be used to justify Hales' speculation that other husbands agreed to discontinue having sex with their wives to accommodate Joseph Smith. There is simply no analogy between Joseph Smith asking Kingsbury to enter into a pretend marriage with Sarah Ann and the suggestion that Joseph Smith asked the husband of a woman who may have had several children by him to stop having sex with his own wife. Of course, this is pure speculation by Hales, who invented it solely for the purpose of preventing Joseph Smith from having polyandrous sex. Obviously, the model for Joseph Smith's polyandrous marriages is not the unique case of Sarah Ann Whitney, but rather Sylvia Lyon, who, as we saw in the previous video, continued to have sex with her husband. Because Hales' rule is based on a hasty generalization and unfounded speculation, I reject it and regard evidence of sexuality between Joseph Smith and the polyandrous wife as sufficient to establish sexual polyandry. Another apologetic invention that must be dispensed with is Hales' unfounded assertion that where there is evidence that Joseph Smith may have had sexual relations with another man's wife, it should be assumed that the time and eternity marriage voided the civil marriage, and therefore the woman experienced sequential marriages rather than polyandrous sex. He explains how this would work. If a woman is wedded to a husband by each authority, that is, if she is legally married to a husband, but is also sealed in the new and everlasting covenant of marriage to a second husband, the new covenant ratified by priesthood authority overrides the earthly contract. By accepting the new covenant, the participants acknowledge a practical dissolution of the union in what might be considered a religious divorce. Hales tries to support his theory by referring to an 1830 revelation which directed that converts be rebaptized into the new and everlasting covenant of Mormonism, because all old covenants are done away. This interpretation of D&C 22:1, which voided all non-Mormon baptisms, is problematic, since Hales does not interpret it in the obvious way of voiding all non-Mormon marriages, but rather applies it only in a few of the polyandrous marriages where he can't otherwise escape the evidence for sexuality. While this is Hales' favorite fallback apologetic device, he acknowledges he is on his own in asserting it. The question arises whether a marriage in the new and everlasting covenant would cause a legal marriage covenant to be done away. We have no record of Joseph Smith addressing this question, but the revelation, D&C 22:1, declares that the new and everlasting covenant does away with all old covenants, which seemingly would apply to matrimonial covenants as well. The problem with this interpretation is that the revelation was never intended to apply to marriage, since at the time marriage wasn't considered by Protestants and Mormons to be a church covenant, having rejected the Catholic tenet that it was one of the sacraments of the church. Logically, if all old covenants in D&C 22:1 were applicable to matrimonial covenants, one would expect Mormon converts would have been instructed to get remarried by Mormon authority because their civil marriages were considered void, which never happened. Even the July 1843 revelation explaining the new and everlasting covenant of marriage implied that civil marriages were still valid until death. Thus, Hales argues that the civil marriage is voided only in situations where the new and everlasting covenant of marriage is in competition with the civil marriage. However, Hales makes an exception for cases where he believes a polyandrous marriage was for eternity only, especially for women married to non-Mormon men unlikely to cooperate with the conditions of a time and eternity marriage. So according to Hales, D&C 22:1 only applies to the few cases where Joseph Smith married a woman for time and eternity and had sex with her. Thus, in a majority of cases, the civil marriage isn't done away by the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, only in the few cases where the argument is needed to prevent Joseph Smith from living sexual polyandry. Obviously, applying D&C 22:1 in this arbitrary fashion destroys the logical force it once carried with baptism, and it therefore cannot provide an authority or rationale for Hales' apologetic needs. I therefore reject Hales' use of D&C 22.1 as nothing but a weak apologetic invention. Another hasty generalization is Hales' assertion that most of Joseph Smith's polyandrous marriages were for the next life only, which he bases on one unique case of Ruth Vos Serres. Though Hales believes he has other evidence for eternity-only marriage, the centerpiece of his apologetic comes from Andrew Jensen's unpublished notes, where it is claimed that Edward Serres, not attaching much importance to the theory of a future life, insisted that his wife Ruth should be sealed to the prophet for eternity, as he himself should only claim her in this life. I will have more to say about this problematic source later, but the unique circumstances of a non-Mormon suggesting to Joseph Smith that he marry his wife for the next life can hardly be taken as a model for Joseph Smith's own practice. Nevertheless, Hales has used the case of Ruth Vos Serres to justify his speculation that other less documented cases were also eternity-only sealings. Hales made the following graphic to chart his interpretation of the evidence. This graphic was made prior to the DNA results, when Hales believed Josephine Lyon was Joseph Smith's biological daughter, and therefore assumed Sylvia Sessions had married Joseph Smith for time and eternity. He now seems to have adopted an eternity-only position. In this chart, Hales identifies 5 positive eternity-only sealings, 6 probable eternity-only sealings, and 3 time and eternity sealings. In the far right column, Hales indicates which husbands lost their sexual privileges and voluntarily became front husbands to protect Joseph Smith from scandal and prosecution. The no box indicates non-Mormon husbands not likely to give up their wives to Joseph Smith. Possible represents faithful Mormon husbands that Hales believes could be persuaded to sacrifice their wives to Joseph Smith. And the 2 husbands with yes and 1 with probable represent instances where evidence for sexual relations with Smith is strong. Hales admits that with the exception of Ruth Vos Serres' husband, Edward, who encouraged her to be sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, the involvement of the other husbands of polyandrous wives is unknown. He has also admitted that except for Serres, clear statements that polyandrous sealings were performed only for eternity do not exist. I have adapted this graphic to show what I will be arguing in this video. Contrary to Hales' assessment of the sources, I think I can identify 7 time and eternity sealings, which have evidence of sexuality, and 6 others that are probably time and eternity, with only 1 possible eternity-only sealing. It is important to know that Brian Hales did not invent the category of eternity-only marriage. The earliest claim that Joseph Smith practiced eternity-only marriage seems to have been made by his first wife, Emma, except she asserted it for all his plural marriages, not just the polyandrous ones. This position was later adopted by her son, Joseph Smith III, and other polygamy deniers in the RLDS Church. For them, the lack of children resulting from Joseph Smith's polygamous marriages was evidence that all of Joseph Smith's plural marriages were non-sexual eternity-only sealings, that is, if they occurred at all. It was also adopted by later 19th century Mormons to explain polyandrous marriages. As historian D. Michael Quinn has observed, never reconciled to her husband's polygamous marriages, Emma Smith was the first to claim that they were all for eternity only. Likewise, eternity-only polygamy became the fallback position of Emma's son Joseph Smith III in combating 19th century claims of LDS leaders in Utah. Eternity-only polygamy later became the claim of Utah Mormons, who were embarrassed about the already married women who were the prophet's wives during his lifetime, while eternity-only became the assumption and claim of those women's descendants. Its palatability as an explanation doesn't make it accurate. Lucy Meserve Smith recalled working for Emma Smith in 1845 and hearing her deny Joseph Smith lived polygamy. Sister Emma bore testimony to me that Mormonism was true as it came forth from the servant of the Lord, Joseph Smith, but said she, the 12 have made bogus of it. She said they were living with their wives and raising children, and Joseph never taught any such doctrine. They were only sealed to them for eternity. When Lucy told her husband, George A. Smith, what Emma had said, he said, "Emma knows better." He then related to me the circumstance of calling on the prophet one evening about 11 o'clock, and he was out on the porch with a basin of water washing his hands. I said to him, "What is up?" Said Joseph, "One of my wives has just been confined, and Emma was midwife, and I have been assisting her." He said she had granted a number of women for him. Emma's vacillating acceptance of her husband's polygamy is well known, and this incident likely dates to her brief period of acceptance in May 1843, when she approved and participated in Joseph Smith's marriages to sisters Eliza and Emily Partridge, and sisters Sarah and Maria Lawrence. In another account, dated 1892, Lucy said George told me this to prove to me that the women were married for time, as Emma told me that Joseph never taught any such thing. They were only sealed for eternity. They were not to live with them and have children. Possibly Emma borrowed the idea from Joseph. It may have been one of the lies he told Emma before she eventually learned the truth. That is, if Emma didn't invent it herself. Regardless, it is more than significant that the eternity-only apologetic was born of deception. Regarding Emma's influence on Joseph Smith III and others in the RLDS Church, Hales said, "During the 19th century, RLDS church leaders, especially Joseph III and Emma's sons, repeatedly attacked the LDS claim that Joseph Smith had restored polygamy by pointing to the absence of offspring from his polygamous wives. They made a double-pronged argument that the absence of children meant either that Joseph Smith had not married plural wives, or that if he had, these marriages were purely ceremonial and had not included sexual relations. Ironically, Joseph Smith III's reasoning for rejecting the claim that his father had lived polygamy was similar to Hales' rejection of polyandry. In 1860, Joseph III declared, "I believe my father was a good man, and a good man never could have promulgated such doctrines." Joseph Smith III biographer Roger D. Launius noted that in spite of countervailing evidence, Smith subscribed to a postulate as immovable as a geometric theorem. 1. Joseph Smith Jr. had been a good man. 2. Good men do not practice polygamy. 3. Therefore, Joseph Smith Jr. could not have been involved in Mormon plural marriage. Quinn has also seen the irony in Hales' use of the eternity-only apologetic, stating, "I regard his negative arguments about sexual polyandry as an updated version of the denials by Joseph Smith III until his death, and by members of his reorganized church until the 1960s. They likewise refused to believe any evidence that the founding prophet had plural wives during his lifetime, or if he did, Joseph III insisted that they were for eternity only." Although they rejected Emma Smith's assertion about eternity-only polygamy, late 19th century Mormons adopted it to explain polyandrous marriages. For example, in her 1892 testimony during the famed Temple Lot case, Bathsheba Smith, first wife of Apostle George A. Smith, mentioned that she observed Jane Law being overly familiar with Joseph Smith, which led her to make the incorrect assumption that she was one of his secret wives. When asked how that could be possible, since she was already married to William Law, one of Joseph Smith's counselors in the first presidency, Bathsheba said she was sealed to him for eternity, and then explained, "Sometimes they are married for time and eternity, and sometimes only for time, sometimes for time, and sometimes for eternity." Hales believes Bathsheba's testimony suggests that sealings for eternity did occur prior to the prophet's death. However, Bathsheba was completely wrong about Jane Law's marriage to Smith, and she was only speculating about the type of marriage it would have been, which no doubt was influenced by post-1844 discussions. Bathsheba made it clear that she didn't know who Joseph Smith's plural wives were during his lifetime, and that she only surmised some of them after his death. She said she saw women at Joseph Smith's house in Nauvoo that I thought were his wives. I supposed they were. Well, I did not at the time, but I afterwards supposed they were his wives. When asked if she knew of the revelation on plural marriage, or if her husband George A. Smith told her about it before Joseph Smith died, Bathsheba said, "It is possible that he did not tell me of it before Joseph died. It is possible that he did not tell me of it until afterwards. It seems to me now that he did not, but I am not sure of that either." Obviously, if she wasn't a polygamy insider during Joseph Smith's lifetime, it's not likely her knowledge of eternity-only marriage dates to that time. Bathsheba's testimony, therefore, is merely after-the-fact surmising and rationalization on her part, the same as what Hales is doing now. 19th century Mormons had another source legitimizing their speculations about eternity-only marriages. After Joseph Smith's death, some women were married to him in time and eternity sealings who had not been married to him in life. These were truly eternity-only sealings, and it is likely this practice that gave speculations about Joseph Smith's polyandrous marriages currency. Concerning these proxy marriages, Apostle John A. Whitsoe said, "After the death of the prophet, women applied for the privilege of being sealed to him for eternity. These women, who were not in any sense earthly wives of the prophet, have been counted by uninformed or antagonistic writers as wives of the prophet." Nauvoo temple records for 1846 do indeed list several women who were sealed to Joseph Smith by proxy who were evidently not married to him during his lifetime, although the records use the phrase "for time and all eternity." This practice was begun under the direction of Brigham Young and the 12 Apostles, and continued throughout the 19th century, so that polygamy researcher Stanley Ivins could report that at least 246 dead women had been sealed to Joseph Smith and 150 to Brigham Young. This program of eternity-only sealings was based on Joseph Smith's theology that a person needed to be married for eternity to enter into the highest degree of the celestial kingdom, which he expressed in May 1843. This led to the apostles instituting various kinds of sealings, the mass sealings of unmarried young women to general authorities with no apparent intention of making them real wives, and sealing men to men, for example, which were eventually discontinued because they were judged to be unnecessary and excessive, and among them was eternity-only marriages. None of this had anything to do with Joseph Smith and his marriages to already married women, and more to do with the organization and expansion of the temple endowment and associated ordinances conducted under the direction of Brigham Young in Nauvoo following Joseph Smith's death. Whitsoe used these posthumous eternity-only sealings for inspiration to explain Joseph Smith's marriages to already married women, obviously meant as a response to Fawn Brodie, who included 12 polyandrous marriages in her list of Joseph Smith's wives, although he had no evidence to support his claim. Yet, he argued, another kind of celestial marriage seems to have been practiced in the early days of plural marriage. It has not been practiced since Nauvoo days, for it is under church prohibition. Zealous women, married or unmarried, loving the cause of the restored gospel, considered their condition in the hereafter. Some of them asked that they might be sealed to the prophet for eternity. They were not to be his wives on earth in mortality, but only after death in the eternities. Such marriages led to misunderstandings by those not of the church and unfamiliar with its doctrines. To them, marriage meant only association on earth. Therefore, any ceremony uniting a married woman, for example, to Joseph Smith for eternity, seemed adulterous to such people. Thus, eternity-only marriage was given as an explanation for polyandry long before apologists believed they had any evidence for it. While the RLDS apologists had Emma as authority for eternity-only sealings for all of Joseph Smith's plural marriages, the Utah Mormon apologists could not use Emma's testimony, although they were no doubt inspired by it, along with eternity-only sealings in the Nauvoo temple following Joseph Smith's death. Apologists believed they had an explanation, but they needed specific evidence for non-sexual eternity-only polyandry among Joseph Smith's wives. In a widely disseminated paper delivered in 1986 at Salt Lake City's Sunstone Symposium, titled Pseudo-Polyandry, Explaining Mormon Polygamy's Paradoxical Companion, Andrew F. Ehat announced that he had found evidence for eternity-only sealings in Zina D. Huntington's 1898 interview with RLDS elder John W. White. In the interview, Zina said that her brother Dimmock performed the marriage, but when Brigham Young returned from England, he repeated the ceremony for time and eternity. This led Ehat to assert, Zina was sealed only for eternity when first sealed to Joseph Smith by her brother Dimmock in October 1841. She also stated that sometime later, during the lifetime of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young performed a second sealing ceremony between her and the prophet, but this time they were sealed for time and eternity. Apparently, before this second sealing was performed, Henry Jacobs, Zina's legal husband, consented to relinquishing her to the prophet for both time and eternity. Although Ehat seemed willing to concede Zina's marriage to Smith included sexual relations, his assertion about Henry Jacobs relinquishing Zina as his wife to Joseph Smith was pure speculation. Nevertheless, he wanted to use Zina's case as evidence that the notion of eternity-only marriage existed in Joseph Smith's time, and wasn't just an invention of the apologists. However, Zina never said the first ceremony was for eternity only, and the second for time and eternity. To the question, I believe you claim your brother officiated at the marriage, Zina, who at the time was polygamously married to Brigham Young, replied, He did at the first. When Brigham Young returned from England, he repeated the ceremony for time and eternity. Zina did not say the first was an eternity-only sealing, but Ehat interpreted this in a way that would harmonize Zina's subsequent answers. But those answers were uncooperative, evasive, and intentionally misleading. If she expected that she was simply going to affirm her time and eternity marriage to Joseph Smith and skip the polyandrous implications, she quickly found that wasn't going to be the case, and she became combative and evasive as soon as her husband's name was mentioned. I believe you married a man by the name of Henry Jacobs, did you not? Yes, sir. Can you give the date of that marriage? No, sir. You had a license, I presume, from the state of Illinois. I do not know. I knew nothing about licenses. Can you tell me where you married Mr. Jacobs? That is, in Nauvoo or where? I can hardly tell you. I do not see what this has to do with my marriage with Joseph Smith. Of course she knew the date of her marriage to Jacobs, as her marriage certificate, signed by John C. Bennett on the 7th of March 1841, is among her family's papers at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Understandably, it was a delicate subject that she wished she could avoid. In the several autobiographies which are among the collections at the LDS Church History Library in Salt Lake City, Zina consistently skipped over her marriage to Henry Jacobs. Skeptical of Zina's claim to have been a real wife of Joseph Smith, married both for time and eternity, White pressed Zina for clarification, suspecting that she was either an eternity-only wife or lying. Then it is a fact, Mrs. Zina Young, is it not, that you were married to Mr. Smith at the same time you were married to Mr. Henry Jacobs? What right have you to ask such questions? I was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity. Zina was well aware that marriage for eternity had two meanings, and that White, as an LDS elder, would be predisposed to interpret it as eternity only, and that the Utah Mormons in the room would understand it as shorthand for time and eternity. Obviously, she was trying to avoid testifying that she had sex with two husbands at the same time, Eternity-only sealing is what White wanted to hear, and he pressed Zina for clarification. Mrs. Young, you claim, I believe, that you were not married to him for time. For eternity. I was married to Mr. Jacobs, but the marriage was unhappy and we parted. This was true, but it didn't happen until 1847 when she became Brigham Young's wife. White continued to press her. It is a fact then, Mrs. Young, that Joseph was not married to you only in the sense of being sealed for eternity, as his wife for time and eternity. Mrs. Young, you have answered that question in two ways, for time and for time and eternity. I meant for eternity. Mrs. Young, you have stated that you were married to Joseph Smith for time and eternity. Now, how could you marry Joseph Smith for time when at the same time you were married to Mr. Jacobs? I do not wish to reply. Obviously, Zina was intentionally trying to mislead White and not doing a very good job of it. As Quinn has said, White led her into one trap after another. From this interview, the RLDS concluded that Zina's testimony wasn't credible and suspected that she was either an eternity-only wife, which didn't count as a real wife, or claiming to be a polyandrous wife, which was proof that she was lying. Thus, the editor of the Saints Herald concluded, the results show that Zina D. Jacobs, née Huntington, was not a wife of Joseph Smith. Or if she was, it was at the same time that she was married to and living with Henry Jacobs, to whom she bore a son after her alleged marriage with Joseph Smith. Clearly, Zina's evasive and equivocal answers cannot be taken as evidence that she was married to Joseph Smith in an eternity-only sealing. Hales argues that even if Zina was being deceptive and trying to give White the wrong impression that she had married Smith only for eternity, it is still useful evidence that sealings for eternity as well as time and eternity were then a possibility. However, Hales has overlooked the fact that White and his church already believed Joseph Smith practiced nothing but eternity-only marriage, and therefore Zina's answers had more to do with exploiting White's beliefs than it did about what happened during Joseph Smith's lifetime. Rather, her evasive answers tend to demonstrate that she was married to two men at the same time, one for time and the other for time and eternity. While Ehat believed that the second sealing performed by Brigham Young for time and eternity permitted Joseph Smith to have sexual relations with Zina, Hales believes that both sealings were for eternity only and did not include sexual relations, although he recognizes that his interpretation isn't conclusive, stating on his website that her sealing to Joseph Smith was for eternity only and without conjugality, or for time and eternity and consummated, is undocumented, except for Zina's one statement in the White interview, and will probably never be known. Regardless, there is no evidence of polyandrous sexuality. However, I think there is indirect evidence that her marriage to Joseph Smith was for time and eternity and included sexual relations. In the same interview, Zina also told White, "It was something too sacred to be talked about. It was more to me than life or death. I never breathed it for years." In a biographical sketch, Zina revealed the reason she didn't want to discuss her marriage to Smith. "When I heard that God had revealed the law of celestial marriage, I obtained a testimony for it myself that God had required that order to be established in His church. I made a greater sacrifice than to give my life, for I never anticipated again to be looked upon as an honorable woman by those I dearly loved." Zina's worry about her reputation and wanting to keep her marriage to Smith secret, even from her family, seems excessive for an eternity-only sealing. Rather, this glimpse into her feelings, together with her failure to mention Jacobs, would seem to confirm that her marriage to Joseph Smith was indeed for time and eternity and included sexuality. Another source confirming sexuality in Zina's marriage to Smith comes from Anne Eliza Webb Young, who along with Zina was one of Brigham Young's plural wives. After divorcing Brigham, and Eliza published an expose in 1876 titled Wife Number 19, wherein she stated, "One woman said to me not very long since, while giving her experience in polygamy, the greatest trial of her life was to live with her husband and Joseph at the same time." Writing to her friend Mary Bond the same year, and Eliza's mother, Eliza Jane Webb, revealed the identity of the woman mentioned in her daughter's book as Zina D. Young. Hales tries to brush this source aside with the weakest of arguments, questioning her account because she did not live in the Lion House with Brigham's other wives, but a few blocks away, and doubting that Zina would have confided such a delicate and painful subject to this young and relatively inexperienced woman. Hales argues that Zina's reluctance to answer White's questions in 1898 is reason to doubt Zina would have been forthcoming with fellow wife Anne Eliza 20 years earlier. However, being reluctant to disclose sensitive information publicly to an enemy isn't an indication of how she would behave privately. If being sister wives in the same family and frequently in one another's company isn't good enough for Hales, it's hard to imagine what would satisfy him. While Hales classifies Zina's sealing to Joseph Smith as probably eternity only, I categorize it as a probable time and eternity sealing with evidence of sexuality. There's more to discuss, but I think it should be clear by now that despite the efforts of the apologists, there is considerable evidence for Joseph Smith's practice of sexual polyandry. I hope you will join me for part 3, where I will continue to discuss Hales' questionable evidence for eternity-only sealings, especially the case of Ruth Vos Sayers, and present more evidence for sexual polyandry, which Hales has tried to dismiss. Thanks for watching. I'm Dan Vogel.